Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. Today I have Mr. Jayant Bhandari with me, and we will be talking about a lot of things that may offend a few people, but that is never the intention. But before we go into that, let me quickly introduce Mr. Bhandari. Mr. Bhandari is an investor. He's a consultant. He's an expert in financial and economic matters. He has a great insight in the economic matters around the world with a particular focus on India. Mr. Bhandari, I welcome you to my show.
Mr. Raja, thanks very much for having me here.
It's such a pleasure talking to you. Well, let's get straight to it, shall we? India, fifth largest economy, and the unprecedented rise, and to many, the rise that was not even predicted by many people. And the great numbers are thrown about here and there. Everybody's trying to explain how India is becoming a next economic power, or already is an economic power. But you don't share that view, do you?
Well, what do you mean when you say India is the fifth largest economy? That makes absolutely no sense to me. When you compare gross domestic production, GDP of countries, you have to compare GDP on per capita basis. So you have to divide that GDP by 1.4 billion people to come to an assessment of how rich that society is.
Sure.
Now, GDP per capita of India is $2,200 per capita, which makes it among the poorest countries on the planet. It is
about 139th position or thereabout in the world, yes.
That's true. The second mistake with what your earlier statement was the rise of India. I haven't seen a rise of India. I have been going regularly to India for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And what I have seen over at least the last 5 years is an economic and social and cultural stagnation.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say deprivation has hit that society. Perversion has hit that society. So the whole society is falling apart. So I don't even understand what people mean when they talk about the rise of India. The only thing I see is that they want to promote India against China. But there is a geopolitical interest behind it that doesn't change the reality, the ground reality of India.
Well, that's very true. And the mistake you're alluding to, I call that a mistake, but unfortunately, the type of media we encounter, normally it's presented as a great achievement of India. But there are fair few, it's a number of mistakes that we have to go through, and we have started with one. The dust or the fog of numbers, that it's so easy to impress people when you have great numbers talking. But when those numbers are not reflected or not translated into people's daily life, then you're absolutely right. Then it doesn't make a lot of sense. So fifth largest economy in a way it's very impressive sounding soundbite. But when you deconstruct it, you realize that, it has become the largest economy or one of the largest economies because it's a very big society. There's a lot of people living there. And if most of the produce is consumed at that level, then it will look like there's a great economy. But that is to say that there are just too many people eating a lot of food. That is not to say that it is translating into the actual richness of India.
There are not many people eating a lot of food.
Or consuming the goods, if I can say.
With rampant hunger, and I have seen a massive increase in beggars and hunger over the last few years, since the time Modi government started their demonetization exercise.
Well, that's another interesting thing, and thank you for correcting me. It's not too many people eating a lot of food. It's basically too many people within the India consuming whatever is produced in India. And obviously, when that many people consume that, it looks like a very big economy, but that is not. Just same as to say, let's say, economy like China or India. So it's a different dynamic that gives rise to these numbers. But when it's a very interesting thing you mentioned after that the demonetization. See, in India we have the industry, in formal and informal sector, and from what we understand, that the most of the information is derived from the surveys. So when it comes to the informal sector or the industry sector, in the industry there, the latest survey is about a decade old. I think it's about 12 years old, and it is based on an assumption that the informal sector would be about 1.25 times the formal one. So when you do the calculations of formal, then you assume that informal will be there, and then that's finally produced as number. So no one really knows if that accounts for the final claims, i.e., India being one of the largest economies and so forth. So it's much of that is based on assumptions. What's your take on that?
Well, a vast majority of Indians work in the informal sector. They work in the agricultural sector. The manufacturing sector of India is mostly informal. Now, you can talk about Apple and you can talk about some of the multinational companies that have tried to move to India. I'm not saying they have moved to India, but they have tried to move to India, which provides this glamorous facade to whatever changes that might be happening. But most of Indians are employed in the informal sector, and the informal sector has been sabotaged by the government because the government does not care about the economy. It does not care about your and my welfare. They care about tax collection. And informal sector does not contribute to the tax collection exercise of the government. So what the government wants is these big companies like Adani or Dilip Buildcon, because they route money for tax collection. So that has been the sole focus. They have destroyed the informal economy as a product of that.
Okay, well that's utterly bizarre, because what is happening is that you're using a lot of numbers from the informal sector, whereas your policies are heavily causing detriment to that sector. And when it comes to the sectors such as agriculture and then whatnot, I mean, there's a lot of disparity, and that's also growing between the government and the actual farmers and the people who work there because of the policies and so forth. And every sector, when you take a look at it, and the international investments, the Apple and all that we will come to that a little later. But right now we're just trying to focus on how these numbers are brought about and how Indian media in particular just does not verify anything apart from a few outlets there. They just take the numbers and they just run with them. But there are other numbers that people don't talk about. For example, if we look at the infant mortality rates in India, 69% of that happens because of the malnutrition. If you look at the poverty rates, every fourth or fifth poor person on the globe actually belongs to India, and no one seems to challenge these numbers. And I said, and stagflation, the joblessness, and so forth. I mean, there's a saying that if your great numbers are not translated into the job creation and wealth creation for the ordinary people, then they are nothing more than what they are. Exactly to be case, they are the numbers. But why is it that we are having? I mean, what is the end goal of creating all this illusion filled with numbers that no one seems to verify and throw them and make it look like as if India is becoming a superpower when it isn't?
Well, the numbers are actually there right in front of you. You can see the numbers, but people if you want to ignore the significance of the numbers, that is your problem. Indian GDP per capita, depending on who you look at, IMF or the World Bank or whoever, is around $2,200 per capita. That is an extraordinarily low GDP per capita for today's environment. The number of stunted children in that country, the number of malnutritioned people in that country is actually worse on per capita basis than what you have in sub-Saharan Africa. That makes India one of the most wretched and poor countries on the planet. Now, you can somehow repackage these numbers and start showing that India is very much where China was in 1990s, and somehow India would start growing at the same pace as that China grew at, and that India would be similar to China in the next 20 years. Now, I can sit in front of my computer and start fantasizing about, sitting in New York office in front of my the nice office in the World Bank. I can look at my screen and I can do this regression analysis. I can overlap the graphs between China and India, and then start projecting in a very linear, naive, simplistic fashion what India would be like 10 or 20 years from now. But the factors underpinning what made China what China is today isn't there in India. India doesn't have the work ethic. India does not have the skilled people. India does not have the harmony. India does not have the cohesion. India does not have a meritocratic government. I mean, Indian government is truly the most venal and corrupt government I have ever come across. And Mr. Raja, I've been to close to 100 countries. And, so you can fantasize. And I think most of the glorification and romanticization of India is based on fantasy to do with what might happen in the future rather than what the state of India is today.
Okay. But there are a few things when it comes to what India has today that is hard to deny, isn't it? For example, one might say that, look, India is on its way to become second largest economy in X number of years. Okay, well, that's a fantasy. Okay, fair enough. We can criticize that. But the fact that India does have $600 billion in its foreign reserves, I mean, that's here and now, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I don't know the exact number of Indian foreign reserves, but again, what does $600 billion translate into? It translates into $400 per person for Indian. That you can increase it or decrease it, but that is not a cornerstone of an economy. Foreign reserves are for your import and export purposes, and it does provide certain kind of a stability to the Indian rupee, but that does not tell you about the economy, the fundamentals of the economy. Moreover, a lot of foreign reserves of India come from the fact that there are a lot of extremely poor people working as laborers and maids in the Middle East, for example. And they send a lot of foreign exchange to the country. A lot of NRIs send money to India. And that is why the Indian government likes to cozy up with Indians living abroad, because they want to bring money of these people. Indian government also provides bank accounts for Indians living outside the country at a higher interest rate. So that money also comes to India. And of course, the unwritten rule there is that the Indian government encourages these Indians living outside the country to avoid paying taxes in the countries that they live in. So while Indian government is obsessive about collecting taxes from Indians living in India, they are perfectly fine with those people and want to help people outside the country avoid paying taxes. So I would completely ignore this issue to do with foreign reserve. In fact, when I try to think about how much does it cost to do business or to live or travel in India, I think Indian currency is extremely expensive. It is about 82 rupees for a dollar. And I think Indian rupee has to fall at least 50% or more to be a viable currency. Now, you can support it for a short period of time, but I see nothing fundamental underpinning the current valuation of the Indian currency. And just to complete this thing, from the 1st of October, if you want to take US dollar out of the country, out of India, you have to pay a 20% withholding tax to the government of India, which means that from a certain perspective, Indian currency actually is 20% lower than what it is in official figures.
Okay. Well, there are two follow-up questions on this. First, on the foreign reserves, that there's a 600 billion or close to it. And quite rightly, you mentioned that it's mostly about the import and exports, but India isn't doing great when it comes to that balance. I mean, mostly there is the trade deficit is in few billions. I think recently, it's about 28 to 30 billion. That is what India pays more for the imports as opposed to what India gets in exports. So 600 billion actually is it's a lot of zeros in it. But when you look at the number that India has to pay out, India needs more than 600 billion. Is that what we're saying?
Well, also, a lot of money comes into the country from Indians who want to invest in India. A lot of fund manager, institutional investors want to invest in India. And, just 12 hours earlier, I had a long chat with a fund manager, an American-based fund manager who wants to invest in India. And you can't convince these people that they would be wasting their money, they would be losing their money. So the trade deficit is currently being taken care of by this huge influx of interest in investments in India. But this is very fidgety money. This will leave the country as soon as they realize that they might not be making money out of their investments.
Okay. And the second thing within your response, you mentioned that the Indian currency needs to depreciate by at least 50% to make it viable. Now, that will take it close to somewhere between 165 and 170 Indian rupees to a dollar. Is there a hint that maybe India is controlling its currency artificially and that it should not?
Well, I can't think of any country that does not artificially controls its own currency. They all do it. What else is the reason behind the central banks? They try to control inflation, and they try to scam people by printing money on one hand and then control inflation on the other hand, because they want to fool people about the real interest rate. They do exactly the same with currency exchange rate. And again, I can't think of any country which does not do it, except the countries that actually have pegged their local currency to the US dollar.
Yeah, I suppose that's one of the evils of the fiat money. I mean, if you have no commodity to support the money printing, then we can come up with the fancy terms such as quantitative easing or the fractional reserve banking and whatnot, and keep on printing where you have no basis for. And you're absolutely right on that. Now, moving to Apple, there's a lot of conflicting information there. For example, Foxconn, they moved from China, and then China, something happened in India, and Foxconn, they had to wrap up their business, or at least big portions of it, and, they just pulled out. And not the allegation directly, but at least the concern is that this could be Chinese muscle behind it, that they flexed, and there went Foxconn, and then a number of other companies followed the suit. And then, this idea of China plus one. So let's tap into the cheap labor available in India. But China, is not exactly happy with the situation, and they're not having any of it. So with the recent decision of their possibility, that's a potential, not even actuality, potential, that they might impose a ban on Apple product within the Chinese either government or the semi-government organizations. And that has caused the collapse of $200 billion from Apple's value in as many days, 200 billion in just 2 days. So where do you see this fight going?
So I have seen this happening, but most of these companies end up making losses. Most of these companies make a show. They make a show of moving to India, but never actually moves to India. So for example,
that's what Chinese companies, apologies for interrupting there, just for the absolute clarity for the audience. Yes, the Chinese companies you're talking about, they make it look like that they want to shift to the India, but they don't. Did I get that right?
Well, American companies or Western companies who have operations in China, they talk about moving their operations to India, but they either don't do it, or when they do this, very soon realize that they made a mistake by moving their operations to India. But let's consider a recent example. Recently, Modi was in the United States, and Elon Musk made it very public that he considers India to be the most exciting country on the planet. He said that India is where the growth is. Now, he forgot to tell the audience that Tesla recently closed its office in India. And when asked when he would be visiting India next, he said he would be visiting India in 2024. Now, if you think India is such an exciting country, why not visit India now over the next couple of months? Why leave it for 1 year and not even make a fixed plan about it? So this is packaging. Now, I deal with people in the Wall Street. And what is important for companies and brokers and analysts in the Wall Street is that they need to show growth to the investors. So they want to show that there's massive growth coming. So stay invested in our stock, and there's a huge amount of future in India. So that's what they want to package, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily believe that India is the future, or that shifting their operations from China to India would help them.
Okay, I mean, that's the Foxconn, I think, is a good example of that. The idea of China plus one, so the essential idea is to create another country alongside China. So let's not just rely on the Chinese manufacturing power. Theoretically speaking, it's a good idea because you would create competition. That means the price will be driven down, and China will be put under threat that we may cut our future business with you because we have an alternative. But it is a political move, and India is being used for it at the moment. I mean, there are other countries, fair enough, Vietnam is one of them, and it's frankly doing better than India, but it's not seen as a significant political figure on the global landscape, whereas India is, or at least is being produced as such. But China isn't exactly happy with the idea, right? China isn't happy with the idea at all. So what are we talking about in this case? I mean, where will this battle go?
Well, I think I keep hearing about China being unhappy about all these things that are happening. I think China probably ignores India, or actually it should ignore India if it doesn't already does so. And now, I was in China about 10 days back. I was traveling around in China for about 2.5 weeks. And anyone who tries to compare China with India is actually clueless about both the countries. China is a first world country when you look at China from the perspective of India. I go to China from India. India is a third or fourth world or fifth world country, I would say, compared to what China is. So, China, from what I see, when I look at the numbers and when I look at the quality of workforce these two countries have, you should not be using the names of these two countries in the same sentence, because it simply makes no sense to compare the two countries. Chinese GDP on per capita basis is 5.5 times that of India. China is growing in absolute value much faster than India is, and India will ever grow at. Now, I know they compare this percentage figures that India is growing at 6.5% and China is growing at 5%, but that's a very deceptive comparison. Chinese GDP per capita is $10,000 or more per capita. 5% of that translates into $500 per capita. So Chinese economy grows by $500 per capita per year, whereas Indian GDP per capita, which is $2,000, if it grows by 7%, adds only $140 per capita. So from that perspective, China is still growing by 3 or 4 times that of India in absolute terms. And I see no reason to believe that operations from China should move to India. I see no real move happening there.
Well, essentially, I think this is what it will come down to, because it's not just the capability when it comes to the financial matters, but it's also a lot of it to do with skill as well, isn't it? Because with the type of acumen China has developed over the decades, India has some catching up to do. And I think the iPhone is a good example of it. I understand 50% of the phones produced by India a couple of years ago, they were not hitting the quality mark expected of Apple, and then they had to sort of do the reruns and so forth. So that problem itself prevails. But the Western governments, they are very, very keen to create an alternative to China. and India being available because of a number of reasons, one of which being that its trademark move by the US in particular, generally speaking, the Western countries, that all of your adversaries, if you can keep them busy in their local areas, then you will tend to do well. At least that's what the ideology is, or what the theory is, I should say. So you keep Russia busy with Georgia or Ukraine, and you keep busy China with, sometimes Afghanistan or Taiwan, and now India. But Indian leadership is, generally speaking, produced as a bunch of very intelligent people, very far forward thinking, and so forth. Not that they are, but this is at least what the Indian media projects themselves as. Can they just not see that India is just being used as a tool to compete with China, which simply is not going to happen? There's no competition there, as you quite rightly mentioned. But the moment the China-US, China-West relationship becomes back to normal, or becomes even better than it has been, India will become irrelevant. Can they just not see this is the future they're heading towards?
Well, India is irrelevant anyway. The only reason the Western media is promoting India, in my opinion, is currently because they want to pander to the ego of the current regime in India, and they want to ensure that there are army bases available in case there is a war between China and the US because of Taiwan. And also, I think the Western governments want to distract China about and confuse it, and by promoting India. So I think it's more of a political game rather than a real economic reason behind promoting India. But remember, it's not, there's a massive lack of skills in India. If you want to get a plumber in that country, it is virtually impossible to get an electrician or a plumber in India because most of those people have either moved to the Middle East or to Singapore or to Hong Kong or even Papua New Guinea. I see Indians working as technicians in Papua New Guinea. So that's India has lack of skilled people. But moreover, there's a complete absence of infrastructure. It's in a very, very bad shape. They keep building roads and highways and bridges, which keep falling apart all the time. Trains keep having accidents. The trains actually are extremely backward. And then, I have in my lifetime never met a government official who does not ask for a bribe. So everything is driven based on corruption. And you might say that, hey, Jayant, you left India 20, 25 years back. Maybe you are out of date with what is happening in India. The reality is that I have met some of the most senior people in the province that I grew up in. And I tell you, I went all the way to the chief minister's office, and it's either mafia controlled or bribes and connections that matter. So that's the problem with that country. How do you do business in a country where there is no rule of law?
No, you're absolutely right. And that's absolutely essential. It's just rule of law, not just in terms of the things you've mentioned, for example, everyday life and the corruption and so forth, but to be able to become a superpower, particularly the economic superpower, there have to be some domestic policies that ensure some level of equality, to some extent security to people. But the rise of the current government and the other parties that share the ideological vision, I am referring to the parties that support extreme Hindutva versions, the way the massive population of still minorities, the Muslims, the Christians, and even within the Sanatan religion, the Dalits, and way they've been treated, it calls for further disparity in India. You cannot become a superpower with that type of systematic discrimination, can you?
Well, firstly, how does it matter to you or me whether India becomes superpower or not?
It doesn't.
800 million people in the country depend on free food from the government. Now, to put into perspective what 800 million is, 800 million is similar to the population of the whole of North America, whole of Europe, and whole of Japan and South Korea added together. So 800 million people depend on free ration from the government. So does it matter to those 800 million people whether India is a superpower or not? Now, what is the hope of India becoming a superpower? I don't see any signal of it. I don't see any symptom of it. I don't see any evidence of India becoming a superpower. It is a country that is economically stagnating. And my view, based on what I have seen recently, is because the institutions are falling apart, the corruption is massively on rise, and mafia now increasingly controls the government. And this is very interesting. This is a Russian-style mafia that is now emerging and is spreading its tentacles within the government. India is not only not a superpower, it is actually on a path to stagnation, and I would say eventual implosion. Now, when you talk about the current regime being, the BJP regime being pro-Hindutva, that is perfectly correct. But it does not matter which regime comes next, because that has become the nature of the Indian society. So every party now panders to the Hindutva elements. They all have to go to temples. They all have to do a lot of drama and money, pandering to the Hindutva, the crowd. So it does not matter. This is set in, it is baked in the cake that Hindutva will continue to rise in that country.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, that's it's a worrying development in its own right. And when that has an impact on the economic policies, it becomes even worse, because studies after studies confirm that the austerity and the financial hardship gives rise to crime and violence. And the violence usually comes out from the places that you are more psychologically connected with or emotionally connected with. So putting these things together and placing them in an Indian perspective or the context, it would look something like this: that the poverty will grow, people will suffer more and more economic hardships, and they are more emotionally affiliated with the religion. Therefore, the violence will become more and more apparent, will become more and more visible in form of the religious violence, because of the emotional and psychological connections. And that cannot be good news. Now, moving on from this, help us understand something rather technical for, I imagine, most of the people listening to this podcast, including myself. You mentioned once that the around 4.9% growth in India is almost same as around 1% in China, about 0.2% in the US. Help us understand that, will you?
So let me do very simple numbers again. Let's say the GDP per capita of the US is $60,000, and I'm just rounding the numbers here. Let's say the GDP per capita of China is $10,000, and let's say GDP per capita of India is $2,000. Now, India seems to be growing fastest in terms of percentage, it is growing at 6.5%. Now, what does 6.5% of $1,000 per capita means? It means $130 per capita. So remember this figure of $130 for India. That is the growth in absolute terms for Indian. Now look at China. China grows at 5% on a 10,000 GDP per capita. What does that mean? That means $500, which means that China in absolute terms is growing about 4 to 5 times as much as that of India. Now look at the United States. United States might be growing at only 2% per capita, but the 2% GDP per capita, but on a $60,000 per capita, 2% means $1,200, which means that the United States is still growing more than twice as much as that of India, and it is growing 10 times as fast as that of India. Now, I rounded up the figures just to drive across this thinking. This comparison of growth rates between the US and India and China is very deceptive. This is something that was taught in primary school that you shouldn't be doing. For example, should you be comparing growth rate of an elephant with a growth rate of a cockroach? Actually not, because even though a cockroach might be growing at a very fast rate, in absolute terms, it will still grow at a very small, it will have a very minimal impact. An elephant can grow at a very slow rate, but it will have a massive impact.
To impact. That's very, very true. But couldn't one make an argument that the people in the US and the per capita income that they have, the life expense they have to meet would be in the US dollars, whereas in India, that would be in Indian rupees, and there is a significant disparity between them. So technically speaking, that should give benefit to Indian people. I understand the limitations and the scope that you referred to. But in that regard, isn't that a good news, given the fact that the life expense, I mean, the cost of milk, I'm talking about the school fees and so forth, all that is paid in Indian rupees, not in dollars. So should that really matter that much?
Well, yes and no, but remember that I don't exactly remember. I think if you convert GDP on purchasing power parity, maybe let's say, I don't have the exact number in front of my in my mind right now, but let's say it's about 100%. So even if you convert that by 100%, still India is insignificant compared to what is happening in the United States. But also remember that let's say a loaf of bread costs you $1 in the United States, and maybe it costs me only 25 cents in India.
Right.
Now remember how that loaf of bread was made in the United States and how that was made, because for IMF and the World Bank, they are the same loaves of bread. For me, they are completely different, because in the United States, that loaf of bread would have been produced in $1 million factory or a multi-tens of $1 million factory, whereas in India, it would have been made on a roadside temporary stall. Now, here is the biggest problem. How likely am I to fall sick because of what I eat in India? And how likely am I likely to fall sick when I eat in the United States? Now, take that into account and you realize that Indian economy, and that is why I was saying that Indian rupee must fall by 50% or more, because Indian economy is such a slow economy that my loaf of bread is more likely to make me sick. A taxi in India will cost me a lot less, maybe 1/4 of what it costs me in the United States, but it will take me about 20 times to get to my destination, the same distance or more. So, when you account for all the factors of production and factors of cost, you realize that India is actually in a very expensive economy compared to the US economy. I'm currently in the US and I prefer to have vacations in the United States or in other Western countries, because ultimately they are cheaper than they are in India.
You want taken in proportionate to the dollars and Indian rupees. Sure. Now, there is something interesting. We have I used to teach illicit financial crime, money laundering laws, and so forth. The University of Bedfordshire in England when I was living there, and we know that as crime you can't do that. But what really, and I'm trying to frame it as honestly as I can, so not to put my personal emotions into it, that more than once Indian GDP has been deconstructed, and it has been proven that they've been cooking up their numbers at the state level. The way in which they calculate is simply not acceptable. I mean, generally speaking, if certain goods hit your shop, and let us say, for example, at 100 rupees, well, that would count towards your GDP. That's a standard formula. That's all fine. But somehow India thinks that no, it is not the cost at which it hit the store, but is the cost at it was sold. So say, for example, if the certain item, let us say sugar, was received at 100 rupees per kg, but was sold at 130, very cleverly, they put 130 towards GDP. So instantly, it's just gone up by 30%. And they've done that more than once. That's crime. How do they get away with this?
Well, Mr. Raja, I don't know anything about this, so I must look at it later. But I mean, I didn't know about this aspect.
Please look into it, because the way I have explained it, because of your financial prowess and your articulation, I think you can understand and explain it probably 1,000 times better than I do. But I mean, when I went through all the reports, I was shell shocked that how do you do this and you just get away with it and nobody questions you? It's just an extraordinary. Now, in the end, I am going to say something pretty controversial here. Now, we compare, I mean, somehow Indian people, they compare themselves with Pakistan a lot more than the Pakistani people compare with India. I mean, in India, with all this financial power they refer to and they talk about and all that, even though, it should be quite clear after this podcast that much of that is just a sort of an exterior based on numbers and nothing to substantiate them. But still, numbers are there and they talk about them, but somehow, the influencers in India and the media in India, somehow they keep on referring back to Pakistan. Oh, we are doing better than Pakistan. One has to ask the question. I mean, if you're doing better than Pakistan, then why do you think Pakistan should be your standard anyway, to start with? But they've made it as such. So I'm going to ask a question on this. I'm going to give you my opinion, then I will take your view on that. I believe that despite the fact that Pakistani economy is in an utter mess at the moment, and a lot of it has to do with the 20 years war, where over $150 billion were lost and nothing much was recouped. 80,000 people were killed. Obviously, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. Not many investors would come. So yes, those were the problems. And after that, there was a series of bad mistakes made by the Pakistani economists and the politicians. And we are in a mess. We are in a mess in Pakistan. Still, I believe that in long run, Pakistan will do better than India because of one critical difference. And that is that people in Pakistan are consciously aware of their financial problems, which is to say that they can find solutions. Whereas India is heading towards financial abyss, and there is a euphoria. The people don't even talk about the bigger problems they're heading towards. And because of this lack of awareness, it looks like that Pakistan will do better because of this conscious awareness. What's your take on that?
Well, at the end of the day, Mr. Raja, they are the same people. They were divided in 1947. They are the same people. I meet Pakistani people all the time during my travels at conferences, and they are the same people. They have the same attitude, similar way of irrational, confused thinking. And both Pakistanis and Indians are obsessed with each other, and Indians are obsessed about Chinese, and Chinese don't care a damn about India. So this obsession and constant comparison with other people is not what they should seek. They should try to improve themselves. And actually, my view is that they should try to actually help each other become better, rather than waste money in fighting wars or trying to compare each other, spreading negativities about each other people, because an unstable Pakistan is harmful for India, and an unstable Pakistan is harmful for Pakistan. Similarly with Afghanistan. So, at the end of the day, the major factors operating here is that at the end of the day, Pakistanis and Indians are very similar people. They speak the same language. You speak Urdu, I speak Hindi. But we can actually communicate between ourselves in those two languages, because Urdu and Hindi are very similar languages. So at the end of the day, Mr. Raja, I have a bad news for you. South Indian subcontinent is headed for a disaster, because over a period of time since 1947, we have, both in Pakistan, India, have actively destroyed our institutions. And that will continue to take both of these countries down. Now we can compare which one is better, which is going downhill slower than the other. But at the end of the day, they are both headed for a disaster.
Okay, well, that's a fair comment. I'm sure many will agree, many will disagree. To tell you the truth, I too disagree with some of the assessments you've made there. But obviously, there's a space for bias, and there I'll be thinking from the Pakistani,
which is very true. So, which is very true, because the borders are mostly closed. So as in, I have been to 100 countries, but I have never visited Pakistan. And
Oh, you
as an Indian, you only hear about the propaganda that Indian media provides you, and you have to go through all of that to see what might be facts and what might not be facts. And pretty much the same cases with most Pakistanis. They have never been to India.
Yeah, that's true. And we get this great military showdown on Wagah border every day. It's one of the greatest desires that I have. That imagine having another place somewhere else on the border where we have cafes and restaurants, and poets and economists and IT professionals from both countries. They get together, spend some time, have a cup of tea and coffee, and talk about issues, and then do the handshake and go home. I mean, this is sort of relationship that I certainly desire for. But the problem, when you do the analysis, then the real picture from this idealistic state that I was living in is different. Just to point out a thing, for example, some economists believe that there are some serious economists believe that by 2075, 4 out of 10 biggest economies will be from Asia. That is, 3 of them are China, India, and Pakistan. And India has got problem with 2 of them. So if 40% of economic power is to shift to Asia, and it's one country that is having problem with 2 of them, well, that's not a very reassuring news. So there's a lot of rethinking that needs to be done in India and also in Pakistan as well, of course. But at the moment, I think keeping focus on India, it doesn't look like a very bright picture with the economic downturn and all that. It's particularly disappointing. Is there this sense of euphoria? They think they are doing well when in reality they are just not.
Well, I mean, 50% of Indians continue to poop in the open, and they are sending missions to the moon. What a disaster of economic situation it is that you don't have money to feed your own people. You don't have money to build toilets, but you're sending moon missions. The Indian regime today is all about drama. It's all about packaging, how to make themselves look good and how to fool its own people. And the media works for the government. You have to be a part of the government. If you're not pandering to what the government wants, your house will get demolished. They actually just come the same evening and demolish your house without a need for a court interference. They take you to the police station, sodomize you, kill you. There's no rule of law left in the country. Not that there was much in the past, but it has continued to deteriorate as time has passed by. And the problem is that it does not matter whether the current Hindutva party stays in power or not. This will continue because this is what gets, in a democratic system, votes. And democracy, again, in my view, is an unmitigated disaster for India because, tribal, uneducated, superstitious people vote on who should run the country, which means that you end up with true psychopaths, true predatory psychopaths who are very spineless running that country today.
Okay, well, this last statement is, it warrants a podcast of its own, but unfortunately, this is where we have to wrap things up. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Bhandari. Such an insightful conversation, and hope this will get the conversation going. The whole idea was to just provide an alternative view that, look, these are the facts, and if you just, cut through the euphoria, you might find different information. I do thank you for your time, and I look forward to have you again in one of the other podcasts. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Raja, thanks for the opportunity.